ourselves when dealing with problematic fermentations is what causes reduced sugar uptake, which is a primary cause of stuck or sluggish fermentation. And usually it's one of these two categories: nutrient limitation and stress factors. Nutrient limitation, not surprising, is often due to insufficient additions to the wine, juice, or must. And these break down into nitrogen, which is a big one, macronutrients, like phosphorus, for example, and micronutrients like iron, which is a key cofactor in a variety of enzymes. And so if you're missing the cofactor, then odds are the enzyme won't function optimally, and therefore the yeast won't survive. Stress factors, by far the biggest, is ethanol toxicity, which would damage the membrane and cause issues with transport across the membrane, for example. And temperature has the same kind of effect. If the temperature is too high, that influences membrane fluidity and membrane integrity, and as a result, the cells have a difficult time transporting nutrients, for example, and even keeping themselves together structurally. The presence of inhibitors is a big one, and so in this particular case, I'm talking about things like acetic acid production by acetic acid bacteria, which can be strongly inhibitory to yeasts, and maybe even killer toxin production by killer toxin producing yeasts. So these yeasts can produce these toxins and antagonize one another with them. I'll talk about that in a different lecture. Another interesting one is the effects of solids. The amount of insoluble solid material in the juice can influence the rate of fermentation as well. There is an optimal, somewhere maybe around 30% weight to volume of solids that one would want to hit, in addition to ideal pH and so forth, for optimal fermentation. The last one then is competition with other microbes. And so these competing microbes, these weeds, if you will, can eat up the nutrients before your primary yeasts, and as a result starve them. And in addition, produce inhibitory compounds like lactic acid and acetic acid, like I've already mentioned. The nutrients are obviously needed for energy, and so that's a big one. If the microbe is deprived of certain nutrients, if it's competing for sugar, for example, then obviously it'll have an issue making energy. Another is building blocks. If the microbe is being robbed of nitrogen, it's going to lack the ability to make amino acids, which are then essential for protein synthesis, and certainly a variety of survival factors like sterols that the microbe would need to facilitate producing ergosterol, which is a form of cholesterol that yeasts have in their membrane. As far as nitrogen limitations, this first bullet point is important. Nitrogen uptake is inhibited at elevated ethanol concentrations. And again, so that's a reference to later in the fermentation. So sufficient nitrogen has to be available early and stored in a vacuole in the yeast cells. And so obviously it's got to be present on the front end. The yeast will store the nitrogen and then obviously be able to use it later when nitrogen uptake is inhibited. And you can take a picture at the yeast cell diagrams that I've shown you previously, just to have a sense for the vacuole and some of the other anatomical features of the yeast. But insufficient nitrogen results in reduced or no protein synthesis, obviously, because if you don't have the nitrogen to build the amino acids, and then you don't have the amino acids to build the proteins. And another important point is that you need the right types of amino acids. So if you have high lysine and high arginine, that could be inhibitory to yeast. So obviously you have to check your balance of specific kinds of amino acids. Depletion of yeast assimilable nitrogen, which is abbreviated YAN, represents the total nitrogen available in the must. You have to have sufficient YAN levels in order for Saccharomyces to complete fermentation. Spoilage microbes can utilize a bunch of the YAN, and obviously sanitation and monitoring are key to make sure that those weeds don't outcompete and steal your primary yeast's nitrogen. And obviously YAN deficiencies can result in stress and stuck fermentations. Ammonia is the preferred form of nitrogen for yeast because it's simple. And so usually in a nitrogen deficient must, we supplement it with diammonium phosphate or DAP. And you can make incremental adjustments during fermentation. which could be beneficial in minimizing the risk of stuck fermentations, and also the formation of side sulfide, which side production of sulfide, which is a sort of a rotten egg smell. And I'll talk about that metabolism in a different lecture towards the end in the spoilage lecture, the nitrogen and sulfide relationship. Ammonia results can be expressed as mg or milligrams of ammonia per liter, usually expressed as nitrogen equivalents. And the way you do that is multiply the NH3 results, which you get from your tests, by 0.82, which is basically just because nitrogen has an atomic mass of 14, and hydrogens have an atomic mass of 1. And so 14 plus 3 is 17. So 14, which is your nitrogen component, divided by 17 gives you this ratio, 0.82. A little bit about NOPA, alpha aminonitrogen, or referred to as nitrogen by OPA or NOPA. NOPA is determined using a method specific for alpha amino acids. The nitrogen by OPA assay is done with a spectrophotometer, and I probably should have prepared a video for that, but that's all right. But just as long as you know what the basis for that particular test is, you do it with a, like I said, looking for primary amino acids by a spectrophotometer. OPA itself is fluorescent, and it reacts with amines or sulfhydryl groups, actually. So it reacts with amines or sulfhydryl groups and amino acids, peptides, and proteins. And obviously you can use, like I said, a spectrophotometer to detect this fluorescence emission. But you have to measure proline separately. NOPA doesn't include proline, and so it doesn't include measurements of proline. You can take a look at the structure of the amino acid proline to see how the amino group is sequestered in that particular molecule. But it's not normally utilized by yeast, so you don't really want to include it because it kind of would give you a false sense of security if you have a high proline content. And knowing that proline isn't very useful to yeast, so we keep it separate for that reason. But again, sources include free amino acids and partial or complete peptides and proteins. What are the minimum nitrogen levels? And so, year to year variations occur in the same vineyards. But what's interesting is there's also variations between varietals. And obviously that can be influenced by how much nitrogen the grapes are getting, for example, or the vines are getting in the vineyard. But EN ranges from 40 to 50 mg per liter. And, the low end is typically 150, and the high end is typically 400. And then the sweet spot is usually somewhere in between. But if you get to 150, mg per liter, that would be most likely considered a nutritional desert for your yeasts. But I wanted to show you this little case study just to give you a sense for how ETS labs could benefit a winemaker. And so in this particular case on the left, you see the wine chemistry panel that ETS labs, for example, would do for a client. And you're looking at some of the important components. Since we're talking about EN and nitrogen, you can see down at the bottom here the yeast assimilable nitrogen is in that sweet spot, well above 150 and below the 400. And on the right, you can see the bacteriological and yeast panel that was performed. And so there's a variety of yeasts like Pichia and Hansennia spora and Zygosac and Brett, and then a variety of bacteria, as you see here. And then you see the relative concentrations in cells per milliliter for these particular organisms. And hopefully what stands out to you is, the EN is great, but Hansennia spora, this particular yeast, is a little bit off the charts here. And so then after cold soak, we can follow that, and you see this dramatic drop in yan and this dramatic increase in Hansennia spora. And so had these individuals intervened early, when they saw, okay, yan is great, but look at this. Had they intervened early to take some steps to mitigate this problem, then they wouldn't have had this this bloom that resulted in a decrease in yan. As far as phosphate requirements go, we know that it's necessary for ATP formation, but phosphates are also important for the formation of phospholipids, for example. And so phosphate limitation certainly impacts cell growth. If you can't make ATP, or if you can't make the building blocks if you can't produce the building blocks of lipid membranes, you're in trouble, and which in turn reduces biomass yield and certainly directly impacts fermentation rate. So a macronutrient like phosphate, having that as a limiting reactant is detrimental for sure. And then, of course, oxygen is important. Oxygen is required by yeast for lipid and sterol synthesis. There's a few steps, for example, in the formation of ergosterol, which is an important cholesterol-type molecule that yeasts have, kind of like our cholesterol. But in yeasts, ergosterol is used to provide integrity and strength to the membrane. If the yeasts don't have that oxygen to produce those sterols and lipids, they are absolutely in trouble. And so the idea here is obviously you can do a couple things. Optimum oxygen addition at maximum cell density, 1 to 3 days post-yeast inoculation. The idea here is you add oxygen just prior to stationary phase, which increases survivability, and it actually enhances the fermentation rate.